The smell was the first thing that coiled around Alistair Finch's throat. It wasn't just the honest, acrid tang of fresh printing ink, but a heavier, muskier odor, a composite of wet paper, old oil, and a pervasive, low-level dread. At just 17, Alistair had traded the dusty, open air of the countryside for the close, echoing confines of Grimshaw and Sons, and every sense was on edge. The shop was a realm defined by its noises, the relentless, metallic clank hiss of the main press, the quick, tinny rattle of the linotype machines, and the steady, rhythmic thud of a handsetter. It was the backdrop of a mechanical, unforgiving world. Yet, louder than all these sounds was the silence of the apprentices. There were only 3 of them now, including Alistair. They moved with a spectral, hunched economy, their eyes fixed only on their tasks, setting the movable type, tending the paper stacks, or meticulously cleaning the heavy rollers. They didn't talk, not even in the clipped, necessary phrases of instruction or request. When Alistair tried a nervous, introductory pleasantry with the boy nearest him, he received only a blank, distant stare before the boy returned to his work, his lips pressed into a thin, white line. It was as if the very act of speaking was forbidden, a cardinal sin against the shop's deep-seated, unnerving rhythm. Alistair felt the atmosphere press down on him, heavy as a stone platen. It wasn't the labor that terrified him. It was the chilling, preternatural calm that permeated the room. The air was perpetually cold, despite the warmth radiating from the immense machinery. He found himself constantly glancing at the largest, darkest press in the corner, the one they called the Leviathan, its enormous iron wheel turning with a slow, grinding power that seemed to demand not just his attention, but his very presence. He knew then, with a sharp, unwelcome certainty, that he had entered a place where the work was the least of his worries. The greater fear lay in the profound, crushing quiet and the history it seemed to conceal. Mr. Grimshaw was not a tall man, but his presence seemed to fill the shop, pushing the very air into the corners. He possessed a severe dignity, dressed perpetually in a dark waistcoat and starched collar, his posture as rigid and unforgiving as the iron machinery he supervised. Alistair quickly learned to read the man's silence. It was more potent than any shout. The other apprentices treated Grimshaw with a terrifying, almost ritualistic reverence. They didn't just work for him, they seemed to exist solely under his observation. This was the source of Alistair's deepening unease, Grimshaw's eyes. They were a pale, watery blue, fringed by thick, grey brows, and held a weary wisdom that felt less like knowledge and more like a profound, long-held secret. When he looked at the boys, there was no warmth, no sign of recognition or approval, only an unnerving, focused attention. It was the gaze of a collector inspecting his prized, fragile specimens. Grimshaw had an unsettling habit of stopping near the boys as they worked, saying nothing, his gaze fixed not on their hands or their progress, but directly into the middle distance, as if looking through them. Alistair first experienced this oppressive scrutiny while sorting a stack of proofs. Grimshaw paused just inches away, the scent of damp wool and old pipe tobacco overpowering. Alistair's hands trembled, causing a tray of metal type to shift precariously. He risked a glance up. Grimshaw's eyes were locked on his face, but with an intensity that seemed to penetrate the surface, cataloging something deep beneath his skin. The overseer did not criticize the near spill, nor did he offer encouragement. He simply stood, a statue of unblinking judgment, until Alistair, utterly unnerved, lost all composure and had to physically step back from the bench. It wasn't until Grimshaw moved on, his footsteps muffled by the dusty floorboards, that Alistair could properly breathe. He was certain then that Mr. Grimshaw wasn't looking at him as an apprentice. He was looking at him as an object of interest, and the object of interest was being weighed. It took a week of shared, silent proximity for Alistair to catch the first real hint of conversation. The moment arrived not during work, but when Mr. Grimshaw was out for his midday meal, leaving the shop to the drone of the ticking clock and the faint, residual heat of the unlit press. Finn, the older, quieter apprentice, was stacking unbound galleys with a mechanical precision when he finally spoke. His voice was a near hiss, directed towards the floor, as if worried the wood itself had ears. "You're new," he stated, the obvious fact carrying a heavy implication. You still look at the doors. Alistair dropped his own stack of papers in surprise. I suppose I do. It's unnerving. The quiet. Finn's eyes, dark and perpetually shadowed, flickered up, a momentary break in his practiced mask of apathy. The quiet is how you survive, he murmured. It's what the shop demands. He then leaned in, lowering his voice until it was barely more than the rustle of the paper in his hands. This was the moment of the whisper Alistair had been waiting for. They say, Finn began, his gaze darting toward the colossal press, that there were 5 of us just last spring. Now we're 3. Alistair immediately thought of the extra bed in the dormitory, the one with the pristine, unused mattress. The others. Alistair pressed. Finn straightened, returning to his work with a jerky movement, but the words were already out. The others moved on to better prospects, he recited, the official phrase hanging in the air like a poisoned gas. That's the line. Always the same. They moved on. But the way Finn said it, the flatness in his tone, the way his fingers worried the edge of the galley sheet, stripped the phrase of any hopeful meaning. It sounded less like a career advancement and more like a terminal verdict. It was a story everyone in the shop knew, yet no one dared to acknowledge. Alistair realized the whispers weren't tales of ghosts, but the suppressed history of the apprentices, a lineage of disappearances. The quiet was not merely a habit. It was a desperate, ingrained fear of being the next to achieve a better prospect. The apprentices' dormitory was a cramped, airless room on the floor above the print shop, accessible by a narrow, creaking staircase. It housed 4 simple iron beds, but only 3 were currently occupied. Alistair found himself constantly drawn to the 4th, empty bed. It stood in the far corner, a stark symbol of the better prospects Finn had spoken of. But what truly unsettled Alistair was not the emptiness, but the impersonal nature of it. There were no ghosts of the previous occupant's life, no stray book, no worn-out pair of boots, no forgotten shaving kit. The mattress was covered with a sheet that looked unervingly pristine, and the single, thin blanket was folded with rigid, military precision. It was the bed of a traveler who had packed everything, right down to the last scrap of personal history. Alistair tried to imagine the boy who had slept there, the one Finn said left last spring. He pictured him waking up, gathering his few possessions, and calmly walking out the door toward a brighter future. But the image didn't fit the suffocating atmosphere of Grimshaw and Sons. People didn't leave this place for better things, they simply existed within its grinding routine. One evening, a new delivery boy, brought in temporarily to stack paper, was assigned the empty bed. The boy, oblivious to the shop's history, cheerfully tossed his small canvas bag onto the mattress. Alistair watched the other apprentices' reactions. They didn't offer a welcome, nor did they warn him. They simply regarded him with the same hollow, distant gaze they usually reserved for Mr. Grimshaw. It was a look of profound pity, layered with a sickening certainty. They were watching a space being filled, not a person joining a group. That night, as the new boy snored lightly, completely unaware, Alistair lay awake. He realized that the silence in the shop wasn't just about fear of Mr. Grimshaw, it was a desperate, communal effort to erase the memory of those who had gone. To speak their names, to mourn their absence, was to acknowledge the terrible, inexplicable truth of their vanishing. The pristine emptiness of the 4th bed was the shop's true testament, a perfect, chilling vacancy, ready for the next victim of its hidden hunger. Alistair dedicated his work hours to avoiding the colossal printing press known as the Leviathan. It dominated the center of the shop, a monstrous assembly of iron, wood, and grease, with gears large enough to swallow a man's head. Unlike the newer tinny machines, the Leviathan was a relic, heavy and dark, requiring immense power to run its heavy rollers. He spent days just listening to it. During operation, its sound was an all-consuming clank-hiss grind, a brutal, rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the floorboards and into Alistair's very bones. It was the sound of relentless, unthinking power, the mechanical heart of Grimshaw and Sons. But it was during the long, silent periods, when the belt was disengaged and the shop was quiet, that the Leviathan became truly unnerving. The other presses fell silent, but the large machine seemed to retain a residual energy. Alistair would often catch himself staring at the massive flywheel, an enormous circle of black iron. It shouldn't move, yet sometimes, after the engine was off, it seemed to complete a final, slow turn, as if sighing a heavy, final breath. Finn's earlier, fleeting murmur returned to Alistair with painful clarity. "They say that the press hungers." It was a ridiculous superstition, yet Alistair could not shake the feeling that the Leviathan was not merely a machine, but an entity. Its dark surfaces seemed to absorb the light, and its deep shadow was the coldest place in the entire building. One afternoon, Mr. Grimshaw instructed Alistair to dust the machine's iron base. As his hand drew near the main gears, Alistair distinctly heard a sound that was not mechanical, a low, thick, wet sucking. He jerked back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The press stood silent, unmoving. He told himself it was just the oil settling, or maybe the old timbers groaning under the shop's weight. But as he looked at the intricate, interlocking cogs, he was overcome by the certainty that the monstrous machine did not just print paper. It was engaged in a deep, slow, and cyclical digestion. The sound was the press asserting its profound, metallic need. Alistair had worked in various trades before arriving at Grimshaw Sons, and he knew the honest smells of labor: sweat, coal smoke, sawdust, and clean grease. But in this print shop, a particular peculiar scent began to infiltrate the familiar aroma of ink and oil. It was subtle, almost metallic, and distinctly unmechanical. It often appeared after the main press, the Leviathan, had been running for a particularly long, strenuous shift, the kind that demanded the apprentice boys feed it paper until their fingers were numb. When the work finally ceased, and the shop air grew heavy, Alistair would catch a faint, coppery whiff, like the smell of old, dried blood mingling with the iron. It was sharp, cold, and utterly out of place. The first time he noticed it, he instinctively touched his own face, convinced he must have cut himself on a jagged piece of type. His fingers came away clean. He looked at Finn, who was meticulously scraping ink from a roller, and felt compelled to ask. "Finn," Alistair whispered, leaning close, "do you smell that? It's like iron, but wrong." Finn didn't stop scraping. His movements were steady, practiced, and his eyes remained fixed on the dull metal. "It's the oil, new boy," he mumbled, his voice flat. "The old oil turns rank in the heat. Don't worry about the smell, worry about the work." But the dismissal was too immediate, too rehearsed. Finn's response carried the same hollow ring as the phrase, "moved on to better prospects." Alistair watched the other apprentices. When the strange metallic odor was strongest, they worked with an intensified focus, their bodies slightly hunched, avoiding deep breaths. They weren't dismissing the smell, they were actively ignoring it. Alistair knew the difference between the stink of old oil and the cold metallic tang of vital fluid. The fact that the others were so quick to attribute the odor to an ordinary mechanical fault only deepened his anxiety. It suggested this was a known phenomenon, a consequence of the press's hunger, that they had all agreed, silently and desperately, to normalize. He had begun to fear the sights of the shop. Now, he was beginning to fear its scents. Alistair's growing certainty that the shop concealed a horrific secret drove him to desperate measures. He knew he needed proof beyond the unsettling silence and the metallic smell. His focus narrowed to the possibility of a forgotten record, something left behind by one of the transferred boys. He remembered Finn mentioning the older apprentice named Owen, who had vanished 2 years prior. Owen had worked at the bench by the eastern wall, where the papers were stacked highest and the light was dimmest. Alistair began to meticulously clean that area, a feigned diligence that masked his real intention. He worked with a frantic care, his eyes searching the dusty planks of the floor. After several agonizing days of searching under the constant, heavy observation of Mr. Grimshaw, Alistair found it. His fingers brushed against a section of the floorboard near the wall that was slightly loose. It was an old repair, barely noticeable, but under the press of his palm, the wood gave way with a faint, dry squeak. Beneath the board, tucked into the shallow space between the joists, was a small, cloth-bound book, Owen's discarded journal. Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs like the press's flywheel. The risk of discovery was immense. Grimshaw was still in the shop, checking the type trays, his back to Alistair, but his hearing was unnervingly sharp. Quickly, Alistair slipped the small, grimy book into the deep pocket of his apron. Later that night, curled up in his narrow bed in the dormitory, he finally pulled out the treasure. The journal was damp and smelled of mold and old ink. He opened it to the first page and saw the frantic, barely legible script, a handwriting that spoke of desperation and terror. The opening lines were a dizzying mix of everyday details about the shop's workings and terrified, cryptic observations about the quiet men and the machine's demand. Alistair had his evidence, but the true terror lay in what the pages would reveal. Curled under his thin blanket, Alistair carefully began to decipher Owen's journal. The ink was faded and the script was often rushed, but the raw terror embedded in the words was undeniable. The early entries chronicled the same things Alistair had observed: the crushing quiet, the isolation, and the unsettling personality of Mr. Grimshaw. Owen wrote of the overseer's gaze, but added a chilling detail, a peculiar glimmer in Grimshaw's eyes that appeared not when he was angry, but when he was watching the apprentices during moments of intense physical labor near the Leviathan. "It is not pride he holds for the work," Owen had scrawled. "It is hunger for the boys. A slow, measuring calculation." The journal explained the communal silence. Owen confirmed that the boys had secretly agreed never to speak of those who vanished, believing that any acknowledgement, any word of curiosity or distress, would immediately draw Grimshaw's attention and mark the speaker as the next to go. The silence was a shield, thin and ineffective, but the only defense they possessed. Most terrifying were Owen's observations about the machinery itself. He wrote of the press needing more than just oil and maintenance. He claimed it needed attention. "He tends to the great press like it is a child that needs to be fed. But it eats without opening its mouth. And when it is fed, the silence afterwards is the deepest, most suffocating thing I have ever known." The warning was clear. Grimshaw was not just an abusive master, but a steward. He was tending to an unholy mechanical appetite, and the apprentices were simply the inventory. Alistair felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't just a worker here, he was a timed resource. The journal was less a diary and more a desperate, posthumous cry detailing the rules of a fatal game. Alistair turned the brittle pages of Owen's journal until he reached the end. The final entry was not dated, but its tone was frantic, the letters slashing across the paper with desperate force. It detailed Owen's final moments of lucidity before his disappearance. "He called me aside. Grimshaw said the press was running dry and needed a personal touch of oil on the main gears. Alone. He smiled. That terrible, slow smile that doesn't reach his eyes. I know what he means by dry now." The script grew shaky, almost illegible, as if the writer were trying to scratch the words out as quickly as possible. The next lines were the most chilling confirmation of Alistair's worst fears, bridging the gap between mechanical work and monstrous life. "I was there. By the wheel. With the oil can. The light was bad, but I swear on my soul that the press, it moved. Just slightly. A shift in the main cog. Without a soul near it. Without a belt engaged. It was only an inch, but it was enough. The Leviathan is not metal and steam. I swear it breathed." The final words of the entry were a horrifying mess. There was a smear of dark, rusted ink, or something that looked like it, that ran down the page, obliterating the last sentence entirely. It looked like a sudden, violent interruption, as if the pen had been snatched away mid-word, or the writer had been seized. The page was creased, showing signs of having been crushed in a desperate fist. Alistair closed the journal, his hands slick with cold sweat. The finality of the smear told the entire story. Owen had been alone with the press, had witnessed its unnatural animation, and had been silenced immediately after recording it. The metallic scent in the air, the vacant bed, the terrible quiet, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying understanding. Grimshaw was not just presiding over a printing shop, he was tending a carnivorous machine, and any apprentice assigned to work on the main gears alone was marked for a different kind of setting. Alistair knew he could not sleep. Owen's journal had stripped away the thin veil of normalcy, revealing the true danger lurking beneath the grime and ink. He had to know if the silence Owen described, the unnatural stillness, was truly the press waiting, or merely the quiet of a shuttered workshop. He waited until the heavy, rattling snores of Finn and the new boy filled the dormitory. Slipping out of bed, he moved like a phantom, down the creaking staircase and into the main shop floor. The gaslights had been extinguished, leaving the vast space illuminated only by slivers of moonlight filtering through the tall, grimy windows. The shop was terrifyingly different. The reassuring clatter and hum of the daytime were gone, replaced by a profound and heavy midnight silence. The shadows cast by the machinery were immense and distorted, transforming the familiar metal shapes into looming, grotesque figures. Every creak of the old building, every distant sound from the street, felt magnified and alien. Alistair's eyes were fixed on the Leviathan. It sat motionless, a black silhouette dominating the room. Without the belt spinning, without the steam hissing, it should have been inert, a monument to metal. Yet, it pulsed with a palpable, dark energy. Alistair crept closer, his breath held tight in his chest. The machine was not quiet. It was hushed. It was the deep, focused silence of a beast that is fully satiated, or, more alarmingly, one that is patiently watching. He imagined the great, dark iron wheel subtly shifting, the movement Owen had described. He listened for the faint, wet sucking sound he'd heard before. The silence itself felt like a presence, a heavy, cold blanket that muffled his movements and amplified his heartbeat. This was the watchful waiting Owen spoke of, the terrifying calm before a swift and merciless consumption. Alistair realized the shop was never truly empty at night, the press was always awake. Alistair's vigil paid off, though the sight was far more disturbing than any noise he could have heard. He had positioned himself behind a tall stack of newly bound pamphlets near the entrance, a perfect vantage point for observing the great press. The moment came shortly after the faint sound of Mr. Grimshaw's bedroom door closing upstairs. Grimshaw reappeared in the shop, his figure cast in a long, menacing shadow by a single low-burning gas lamp he had lit on a side table. He did not approach the smaller machines or the workbenches. His path was direct and purposeful, leading him straight to the Leviathan. He stood before the colossal machine, not as a master inspecting his tool, but as a devotee at an altar. Alistair watched, breath held captive, as Grimshaw slowly raised his arm. He didn't check the oil reservoir or adjust the settings. Instead, with a motion that was agonizingly slow and unnervingly intimate, he ran his hand along one of the massive, cold iron rollers. It was a gesture of profound, unsettling tenderness. His fingers traced the smooth, dark metal with a lover's care, lingering on the grease and ink residue. The peculiar glimmer Owen had written about seemed to catch the lamplight in Grimshaw's pale eyes. He whispered something, too low for Alistair to make out, but the tone was unmistakable, a soft, proprietorial murmur of appreciation. This was not the interaction between a man and a machine. It was the silent communication between a caretaker and a powerful, living charge. Alistair suddenly understood the metal scent and the crushing silence. Grimshaw was not the engineer of the shop, he was the feeder of the press. The sheer, unnatural devotion in the overseer's eyes confirmed everything the journal had hinted at. The Leviathan was not just hungry, it was cared for. And the object of that care, Alistair knew with sickening certainty, was not the quality of the print, but the sustenance required to keep the monstrous thing quiet and content. Alistair remained frozen behind the stack of pamphlets, the terrible sight of Mr. Grimshaw's tenderness towards the press searing into his mind. He watched the overseer complete his unsettling ritual, stroking the cold iron as one might soothe a restless pet. The moment Grimshaw finally turned away from the Leviathan, Alistair flattened himself further, trying to melt into the shadows. The small gas lamp Grimshaw carried cast a pool of sickly yellow light, and as he began to walk back toward the stairs, he paused near the periphery of Alistair's hiding place. Alistair dared not breathe. He was certain he had remained unseen, that the shadows had been deep enough to conceal his presence. But then, without turning his head or changing his direction, Grimshaw stopped. He was looking straight out a window, toward the dark, unyielding cityscape, but his posture, The slight tilt of his head, the sudden cessation of movement, suggested he was keenly aware of something else entirely. Slowly, Grimshaw's lips curved into a faint, utterly chilling expression, the knowing smile. It was a cold, calculating curve that held no mirth, only a profound, dark satisfaction. Alistair felt his blood turn to ice. The smile was not meant for the darkness outside, it was directed toward a point just past the edge of Alistair's hiding spot. It was a smile of awareness, of ultimate control, and of an awful, private understanding. In that heart-stopping second, Alistair realized two things. First, that Grimshaw knew he was there, and second, that the overseer was not angry. He was amused. Alistair was no longer just an apprentice. He was a trapped mouse, and Grimshaw was enjoying the delicate thrill of the hunt. The smile was a silent affirmation of all the horrible truths contained in Owen's journal. The press did hunger. Grimshaw was its feeder. And now, the feeder knew that Alistair had finally realized the true nature of the shop's terrible sustenance. Alistair was marked. The moment Mr. Grimshaw had disappeared up the stairs, Alistair scrambled out of his hiding place. He knew he couldn't face the morning, or any task near the Leviathan, armed only with fear. He needed an ally, and the only person who possessed a fraction of the necessary shared dread was Finn. Alistair waited until the middle of the following day, when Grimshaw was in the isolated ledger room and the sounds of the active press provided a noisy screen. He cornered Finn by the ink pots, his face pale and urgent. "You lied to me," Alistair hissed, his voice trembling despite his efforts to keep it low. "About the boys. They didn't move on." Finn didn't look up. "Keep your voice down. It is not wise to speak of them." "I found Owen's journal," Alistair pressed, his hand gripping the brittle, cloth-bound book hidden in his waistband. He wrote about the glimmer in Grimshaw's eyes. He wrote about the press moving. Finn's hands, usually so steady, began to shake, causing the ink brush he held to chatter against the porcelain. He finally looked at Alistair, and the usual mask of apathy was completely shattered, replaced by raw, paralyzing terror. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered, his throat constricting the words. "You shouldn't have looked." Alistair shoved the journal into Finn's hands. "Read the last entry." He saw it breathe. "And last night, I saw Grimshaw with it. He wasn't working. He was tending to it. He was running his hand along the roller, like a father to a pet. Tell me I'm wrong, Finn. Tell me the metal smell is just old oil." Finn quickly scanned the final, smeared page. When he looked up, his face was ash-gray, his terror confirming everything. The weight of Alistair's evidence, combined with his own years of suppressed suspicion, was too much to bear. "We don't talk because we fear being chosen," Finn admitted, the words spilling out in a desperate, broken stream. "The ones who vanished, they were always the ones who asked too many questions, who were alone near the main gears. Grimshaw, he feeds it. The press is not a machine. It is a trap." The shared, unspoken fear was finally out in the open, binding them instantly. They had only one thought now. They were the only two left who knew the terrifying truth, and they had to escape before the monstrous Leviathan called for its next meal. The terror that had paralyzed Finn for years now translated into a frantic energy. With the dreadful truth finally spoken, he and Alistair focused entirely on formulating a desperate plan to escape. Their window of opportunity was impossibly narrow. Grimshaw knew Alistair was aware of the secret, meaning the invitation to attend to the main gears could come at any hour. The escape had to be done in the dead of night, after Grimshaw was asleep and the watchman, a drunkard who slept more than he patrolled, had made his final, cursory round. They agreed to gather nothing but Owen's journal and the clothes on their backs. Any personal effects would only slow them down and, more importantly, might alert Grimshaw that they intended to abandon the shop rather than simply flee in fear. Their biggest obstacle was the vast, creaking labyrinth of the shop floor itself. They would have to traverse the entire room, navigating the treacherous shadows and avoiding the loose floorboards that had betrayed them before. The most daunting part of the route was the final stretch. They had to pass the Leviathan and the heavy, bolted loading door just beyond it. Finn explained that the heavy door was secured with a complex, internal iron bar that required a special, heavy key Grimshaw kept on a chain beneath his waistcoat. Their plan was risky. Finn would distract the sleeping watchman, while Alistair would attempt to retrieve the key from Grimshaw's room, a mission that was essentially a direct invitation for death. "We go tonight," Alistair insisted, his voice tight. "Before he has a chance to ask for this special oiling. I'll get the key. You stand ready at the door." The plan was reckless, but the alternative, waiting for the press's hunger to be satisfied, was unthinkable. Every tick of the shop clock was a countdown to their own end, urging them toward the terrifying and immediate gears of escape. The clock in the print shop struck 2 a.m., a sound muffled by the still, heavy air. Alistair, heart-pounding, had successfully retrieved the heavy, ornately carved key from Mr. Grimshaw's chamber, a terrifying feat that had him brushing against the fabric of the sleeping overseer's coat. He found Finn waiting by the loading door, his face a pale ghost in the moonlight. Alistair held up the key, its polished metal reflecting the dim light, a symbol of their precarious freedom. As Alistair moved to insert the key, Finn grabbed his arm, pointing. Their escape route forced them past the Leviathan. In the intense darkness, the press looked more immense, more threatening than ever. But what held their gaze was not its size, but a subtle, unnerving sight. A faint sheen of moisture across the great iron roller, a dark, wet slick that had not been there when they left. It was the oil Grimshaw had administered, the terrible sustenance. Alistair wasted no time contemplating the machine's recent activity. He forced the heavy key into the lock, the sound of the tumblers clicking seeming to shout in the profound quiet. Clack, clank. The sound was deafeningly loud. They pulled the heavy iron bar free, the resulting metallic shriek slicing through the shop's silence. It was too much. They heard a distinct, enraged call from the top of the stairs. Grimshaw was awake. "Stop them. The print must be preserved." Grimshaw's voice was not angry. It was cold and filled with a panicked, possessive fury. Alistair and Finn threw open the door, revealing the dense, foggy Victorian street. They rushed out into the cold air, scrambling onto the cobblestones. But before Alistair could fully clear the threshold, he risked a final glance back. Grimshaw stood framed in the doorway, but his eyes were not on the fleeing apprentices. They were fixed on the Leviathan, which now stood bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the hastily lit gaslight. The great machine, seemingly angered by the disruption, gave a low, resonant grind, its main flywheel shifting again, an inch or two, as if sniffing the air. As they ran, melting into the pre-dawn fog, the image was seared into Alistair's memory. Grimshaw, abandoning the pursuit of the boys, rushing instead to soothe and tend to his monstrous machine. They had escaped, but the knowledge they carried, that the machine had been fed, and that the overseer would soon seek to replace his lost morning edition of Apprentices, was a weight they would carry forever. They left the silent shop, knowing the hunger of the press would eventually call for new victims.